Hello, welcome, and thank you all for joining this month's Humanity at the Heart book club. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and include your contact details if you'd like to. I'm Brendan Martin, founder and MD of the social enterprise Public World. We work internationally to support change based on enabling and supporting public service professionals to operate with the greater freedom and responsibility needed for relational services. In 2015, we began a partnership with Buurtzorg of the Netherlands, which led to test and learn projects in around 40 different settings in health, social care, and social housing. That work produced a rich and growing body of knowledge, which we're capturing in our learning and development programs, which we call Humanity at the Heart. And that's also the name of our online community, which has a section enabling any member, that's around 400 of us at the moment, to flag up a book they think has importance. So we thought, let's have a series of online events with authors, and this is the third of those. The first two you can find recordings of on our YouTube channel. Now, I'm especially excited about this month's book club because John Seddon has been an inspiration to me since I first encountered his work and started reading his books about 15 years ago. So I was delighted as well as flattered when he came to visit me after learning about our work with Buurtzorg and presented me soon after its publication with this signed copy of this important book. Soon after that, John took another step to cement our friendship with a podcast in which he described our endeavors to introduce the Buurtzorg approach to the NHS as, and I quote, shocking failures. That led to an interesting conversation about the meaning and importance of the word failure, a heterogeneous term if ever there was one, and indeed a word I expect to hear quite a few times in today's discussion. So John, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And could I ask you first to briefly introduce yourself and tell us what your book's about and why you wrote it?
Well, I'm John Seddon. My life's work has been helping leaders of organisations understand how to change their organisations from a conventional command and control design to a systems design. That's what the Vanguard method does. And that's all I do. I wrote Beyond Command and Control because although I think by that stage I'd written about 6 books, I've done a lot of writing on what good looks like and the Vanguard method and systems thinking for service organisations and all that stuff. And I thought I'd concentrate more in Beyond Command and Control on how you make the change, because how you make the change is more important than the nature of the change. Interestingly, that will determine whether you're successful. So I talk a lot in Beyond Command and Control about the requirement for normative change. It's a change where you get the leaders to study their organization from a different point of view, and as a consequence, they change the way they think about the design and management of work. If you try to persuade them, talk to them about they need to change the way they think, the response tends to have the second word is off, if you understand what I'm saying. Or as Corporal Jones would say, they don't like it up them. But if they go out and study, they get it, and they are energized to do something about it. So although it does have case material in it, I talk a lot in that book about what they had to study, what they learned from studying, and how it changes the design and therefore gets the results that you would anticipate.
Thanks, John. Now, that's all very clear in the book, I must say. But I'd like to start with a bit of a left field question. As you know, I've been working in recent years very closely with Jos de Blok, the founder of Buurtzorg.
Yeah.
And Jos's face lights up if anybody says it describes him as an anarchist. Would you describe yourself as an anarchist?
Well, I don't know. When I went to school, anarchists were people who would use violence to change things. I don't think I've ever resorted to violence to change things. So no, I wouldn't say I'm an anarchist. I mean, of that genre, I suppose I am a rebel. I'm the guy that wrote the case against ISO 9000. That was actually quite popular in Japan because they were curious about what is this thing that we've got to do in order to trade with the UK. So the Japanese were interested, and indeed Ibi, who's here, organised a study tour of ISO 9000 in British manufacturing for a Japanese visitor who translated that book into Japanese. Um, so, but I'm a rebel for sure. But I'm not a rebel. I mean, I do, if I get on a platform, I have to talk about things that are wrong. But if in the days when I was working in an organization, there's no point in telling them that what they're doing is unhelpful, dysfunctional, even dystopian. There's no point in doing that. The point is to help them in such a way that they see it and they feel able to move. So no, I don't think anarchist is that's not me really.
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think Yoss is an anarchist either, but that's a conversation
No,
I'll have to have with
no.
him sometime. Um, you mentioned there the approach you take with the Vanguard method, and which you outline very clearly in the book, and
Yeah.
that it starts always with study of what
Mm,
is actually happening in the organization and the system. So, and before I go on, let me say I'm not going to ask lots of questions. I'm going to bring everybody in. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand, either virtually with the symbol you can use in Zoom or with your actual hand, and we'll try and notice. And Jade, could I just ask you also to pop at some stage the public world email, sorry, website address into the um, into the chat.
Yep.
So we'll try and keep track of all your questions. But the next one I want to ask is this: as I say, John, you say you're at the core or at the beginning of the approach you recommend is really studying what's going on. So my question is, if leaders of organizations and managers more systematically listen to their frontline workers as a matter of course, would they still need to carry out those studies you're mentioning, or would their everyday routines involve being able to know what is going on in their organization quite accurately?
Well, it depends how they think. If you jump forward to the future, if the organization is being run as a system, then it will have control where the work's being done. And that would have been set up by leaders who understand why the controls are there. And those controls will be operated by people who understand why those controls are there, what they're setting out to do. And the conversations will be very sensible. But if you walk into a conventional command and control organization, and even if the leaders, have a religion about managing by walking around and asking questions and all the rest of it, then no. I mean, what are the questions they're going to ask, or what are the people going to say? If people say anything that counters their conventional view of the world, the simple things. I suppose you've got a BT engineer coming around your house, and the managers are saying they want 4.2 jobs per man per day. And the engineer was to say to the manager, well, actually, that's not really sensible given what we're doing in the work. The manager wouldn't feel very warm about that. I mean, if you said to a manager of, if the heating engineer said to a manager of heating engineers, boss, when we visit a house to fix a boiler or whatever, we really ought to make sure the whole system is working properly for them, because what matters to the customer is they want heating and hot water all the time. The managers would go, no, 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 that'd be too expensive. But, that manager hasn't understood how expensive it is to do it the way they're doing it, because he's looking at it on a per transaction basis. He's not looking at it from the point of view of what matters to the customer and running his system that way. So, nice, comfortable, great idea, but no. No, you've got to ask the right questions. I tell you what, though, what I learned in the late 80s and early 90s when I worked with the same leader through a series of companies that we turned around is that when the leader's out there working on the right issues with the people, changes really fast.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Jade, could I ask you to switch so that I can now see everybody, rather than just John and myself? Can you do that? That's right. And
I
then,
think so.
okay, that perfect. Thank you. This way I'll be able to see, you'll be able to see John, I hope, very clearly when he's speaking, but I'll be able to see who's got their hand up and would like to ask a question. And if you haven't got your camera on, I won't be able to see any kind of hand that's going up. So I'm assuming you don't want to get involved if you haven't got your camera on. And I'd really love it if you did have, so that we could all get engaged a little bit more. But can I ask, and who else would like to ask a question? I know that my colleague Kay has got one that she'd like to ask. I'm going to bring you in a little while, Kay. Let's see if anybody else has got another question first. Kay, go for it.
Hello, my name
Right.
is Kay. I am the current marketing and communication intern for Public World. I first want to thank you, John, for taking the time out of your day to attend this book club. I think that it's really important to all of us. Um, I feel like I was most intrigued when thinking about the transition that you made from occupational therapy to self-organization or self-management organizations, I should say. So I
Yeah.
was wondering how your work in psychology informs, the book that you wrote and your current work today. Thank
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it goes right back to well, where it all started for me was I was working for the Home Office as a prison psychologist. Would you believe? When there were only 42,000 people in prison, things have changed. And I met a fella Nick Georgiades from London University. He had the chair at Birkbeck College in occupational psychology, and he said, instead of working with individuals, John, why don't you work on the system that'll have more power? And I thought, I was a very young person, and I thought, well, that sounds good. So I went to study under him. I did the master's degree in occupational psychology, and I learned a lot. My love came through for intervention theory and method, which informs the Vanguard method. But I didn't do anything about it for a while, so I had nothing to intervene on. I had no sort of meat in my sandwich, is the way I often put it. But then I had the good fortune in the mid-80s of being asked by Honeywell Bull to audit a total quality management program that failed. And being a bit scientific, I thought if you're going to understand why a total quality management program failed, you better understand how an organization works. So I'd interview managers about how it works. And I was reading the books on quality, and the connection between what Deming was saying in Out of the Crisis and what I was looking at in front of me was so real that I thought the problem here is management. The problem here is management. And the reason the TQM program failed is that the tools, the theory implicit in the toolbox was diametrically opposed to the theory of the firm. And so it's never going to win. Um, and that got me terribly interested in Deming's work because, as you may know, Deming is responsible for the Japanese miracle. This is Japanese manufacturing in the 1950s. And the Japanese economy grew by 9% a year in the 1950s, largely because the manufacturers were understanding what he was teaching them, and they went from being producers of poor quality, low price goods to high quality, high margin goods, and of course, grew enormously. And I thought, well, I'd like to do that in service organizations, and that's what got me started. I looked in all the systems literature and couldn't find any answers. Basically, had to work it out. And the fellow I was talking about, that I worked with through the 80s and into the 90s, he and I worked it out in a series of companies. What you got to do to change it from being a conventional command and control design to a systems design. So that's how it all happened.
Thank you, John, and thanks, Kay. And Matthew Measy, I see, and welcome. Nice to see you. And I see you've got your hand up. So, and let me stress, you don't have to ask questions. You can make your own observations if you want to. Go ahead, or both.
I've got a question. Hi, John. I
Hmm.
hope it makes sense. It's a tiny bit complicated, but if I'm understanding things correctly, sort of approaches like Bert's org, which really give the client what they need. They don't
Yeah.
sort of divide things into time and task and all that kind of thing that actually makes things far less efficient. increases the failure demand. That,
Yeah.
you know, that sort of makes sense to me. And you hear people saying, well, you know, like Toby Lowe will calculate how much, if you could spread that around the UK, you know, he came up with a figure, it would save 37 billion, which is, you know, interesting. I'm sure it's incorrect as a figure, but it's interesting. But the question I have is that when you speak to some NHS type people, they will also talk about, you know, failure demand and that kind of thing, but they would say it's all about errors. It's all about defects in systems. They never talk about the relational stuff. It almost feels to me, and this is what I was going to ask, is that some people are talking about a very sort of complex relational space of people with multiple complex needs. Other people are talking about a more, you know, straightforward space where you're talking about single conditions, and it's you could call it complicated, but you wouldn't really call it relational and complex. Like, is there any light you can throw upon those seemingly different ways of where failure demand appears to turn up?
Yeah, I'll try. You know, and I often say this, you know, of all the concepts I've developed, failure demand has got the fastest legs. It's really easy to understand, isn't it? But it's equally easy to misunderstand. And you know, what you described there is a classic misunderstanding. Oh, let's look at these events. These events are failure demand. No, that isn't going to help you. It's going to take you, you know, you're going to fix the wrong things. So people think that failure demand is down to people not doing as they're told or processes not working properly. And it's not. It is systemic. And the paradox in the NHS is that the very measures that they're using to run the NHS are creating the failure demand. You know, it's run like a factory. You know, they're worried about utilization and they're worried about activity management. You know, what more failure demand is create more activity. You know, so you know, because you've got tariffs, you get more money. You know, what you've got to look for is understanding how the system creates the failure demand, and it will be in the controls. It's always in the controls. It's the way we're using the controls to manage the system. That's what's creating the failure demand. It's also very interesting. I mean, Ibby's done all of this work, and he's here. But you know what he'll tell you is that whenever we look at demand into the health service, what we learn is that there are groups of patients that are consuming a disproportionately large amount of the capacity. Okay, so that's telling you that these are people that we're not helping. And if we can understand how to help these people, they will have an improvement and we will have a releasing capacity. And I'll tell you what, you know, I get very exercised about the NHS. You know, you see, they think in the NHS the job is to manage demand. You know, you hear this all the time. Demand is rising. Well, do you know what? We have studied demand into care services, and it's stable. You see, because what we're looking at is the number of people that turn up in a period. That's stable. What is rising, of course, is the volume of transactions, and most of those are failure demand. So it looks like demand is rising, but it's not. It's transactions that are rising, not demand. And the only clinician we've worked with who studied major types of demand into an NHS trust, he was doing stroke care. He had to study demand as part of what you've got to do in a transactional system. He was surprised but enthusiastic to learn that the demand for stroke care in his area was stable. You know, this is important. If you know how many strokes you're going to get next week, you're halfway there to designing a system to accommodate them. But he also found that he did work on other major conditions and found they're all stable. Now, you see, this is where, you know, it goes back to what I was talking about with Brendan. If you say to the leaders of the NHS that actually, and care services, actually demand for adult social care is stable and demand for major conditions in the health service, as far as we know at the moment, is stable, they will say, well, you must be smoking something weird, because that ain't true. Well, not according to their data, it's not true, it's because of how you look. You see, so that we know, so that's a very important, you know, example of if you get them out to study demand from an outside-in point of view, they will learn the things that others have learned, and they cannot then deny it.
Thanks, John. Gary, we've not met. Welcome. What's your point or your question, please?
Yeah, hi, Brendan, and thanks to you and to John for your time today. I was lucky enough to work with Ibby, if he can remember,
Yes.
a few years ago at a life insurance business. We were looked at their claims, and you'd think a life insurance claim, someone dies and they get paid, but they don't, not instantly anyway. So it was a fascinating piece of work. My question and my point was going to be about the NHS actually, so I'll slightly change it. So I suppose I've got two experiences. So one is because wherever I go now, I think like I like to think I'm a systems thinker. I walk, you go into see a GP, they have 10 minutes, so they can't look at you as a person. They look at just your problem there and then. But a really good GP actually sees their purpose as trying to help people. So sometimes they flout the rules. But that's why they see demand going up, because you go back and you go back, don't you, if you've got a problem. So I saw that, and I constantly think, no wonder failure demand is going up, because they get 10 minutes to see you and they can only see you about one problem. So that's just mad, isn't it? But then also my other experience is I have a condition, and I was referred, as you do get referred all over the place, don't you? And you know what? That person spent an hour with me face to face and looked at everything, right? So not just my condition and right, here's your medication, go away, but my lifestyle, what other conditions I've had, my lifestyle, all that stuff. So I think I'm on the way to seeing in the NHS something that's systemic, because he then said, right, we'll do these tests, and we'll do a logical way of working out. So anyway, so I think I'm seeing two different things going on. My question was going to be, with the NHS, I think systems thinking would be a great way into it, and I'm sure there's lots of ways to improve the NHS that's going on with systems thinking. But given that we have a government that changes every 5 years, we have these targets that people have to meet all the time that aren't about the purpose, and the NHS is probably the most complex organisation in the world and most expensive because of how it's been designed. And so my question to John and anyone else was, what would it take to get into the NHS? Is it a new government that only turns around every 25 years? Is it billions of pounds and let's just throw the money in, because that would be the only way to throw people into? But that's what the government does all the time, right? They just throw money in because they think that's what the public want to hear, and that demand is going up. So yeah, that was my question. I'm just passionate about the NHS, just like you guys. I see things working in the right way, but just tiny bits, only because the people that I see their purpose. But then you walk into. I saw something, just very quickly. I saw something on the wall. I've got a picture of it, where in the GP surgery it says, "We're being killed by the NHS." And they were allowed to put it up, and it was something like, the NHS is crippling because of we haven't got enough money, basically. So yeah, that was my point and my question.
Well, Gary, don't apologise for bringing up the NHS. I don't mind if we speak about nothing else. It's rather important. So, John, over to you.
Well, Gary, I don't think it's a complex system. I think it's an unnecessarily complicated system.
Yeah.
One of the complications, of course, is that they throw money at ideas. Instead of understanding what the true nature of demand is, what you describe happening to you that's productive ought to happen to everybody. It's a much more efficient and effective way to treat people. But unfortunately, the place is run with protocols and a lot of standard activity because it's run as an industrial machine. It's run as a set of factories.
Yeah.
One of the things that really exercises me is why we got 111. I was going to mention this earlier, that why we got 111, because they think they've got to manage demand.
Yes.
No, you don't need to manage demand. You need to have knowledge of demand. You need to understand demand. The 111 is run on call center metrics. There is no measure in 111 of the number of people who actually got help. It's an extraordinary thing.
Really?
Yes. And this, for me, this goes back to the mid-80s when call centers came along and all local but businesses were told, move your work onto call centers because it's cheaper. Well, move your work onto the phone, NHS 111, because it's cheaper. It's the same thing. The mistake they made in the early days of call centers is they didn't work out what you can actually do over the phone. So it created, the one that we worked with had plans for 3, ended up with 5, and it was costing more money than having more expensive people in the branches that used to do the telephone work. That's how crazy it can be. And we're doing exactly the same. And it's because, the NHS leaders and at Whitehall certainly have McKinsey in their pockets and telling them that what you've got to do is industrialize it, reduce unit cost of activity. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Wrong, wrong.
So what would it take, though, John? What would it take to actually make that happen? That's my question. I sort of constantly think, what would it take?
Right.
Would it take systems thinking,
Okay,
a prime minister, or?
All right. Well, some of the thoughts I have on that. I'm writing another book at the moment.
Right.
My book title for the one I'm writing at the moment is going to take a while. It won't be out for a year, I'm sure. Is Productivity and Growth, a Systems Prescription.
Wow.
And part of the prescription is that ministers have to get out of management. We've got this crazy world at the moment where we vote in politicians to represent us. And then how well they do that is an issue, but they also find themselves in positions where they're effectively operating like the chief executive of a whole business, whatever it does. Now, those of you who get my newsletter, I think the office is sending out the newsletter this week. I made a submission to the Health Foundation, actually, because the Health Foundation is concerned about NHS productivity. And it's only a very short submission because I thought, I can write a book about the NHS, but I'm not going to do that. So it's a few paragraphs about what the issues are and how you change it. So you could read that, but I'd also refer you to last year I wrote a manifesto for changing regulation, and this is a big lever. You see, in our public services, people are judged by their reputation, and your reputation is built by compliance with the edicts from Whitehall. Now, given what I was saying earlier, a lot of the edicts that come down from Whitehall are just wrong-headed, and that's not what we need. So we need to get ministers out of management, out of specifying, and we need to get regulators out of specifying. Many examples of where regulators are totally involved in the operations of businesses or public sector services and dictate methods and measures. One of the core frameworks that I've developed is the relationship between purpose, measures, and method. It's in every system. It's there whether you like it or not, and it's helping or it's hindering, and it's hindering big time in the way in which we regulate, because regulators and politicians stray into areas of specifying methods and measures, and people comply. And unfortunately, they are wrong-headed. So we've got to get out of that. We've got to place responsibility for choices of method and measures with the people who run these organizations. It is entirely proper that politicians and regulators should talk about the purpose. Politicians should talk about the purpose because that's their job, to worry about what matters to their citizens. So he's got to talk about the purpose in citizens' terms. And then we make the leaders of these places responsible for choices of method and measures. And that would actually create transparency. They talk about transparency at the moment as adherence to their specifications, their targets, and all the rest of it. And that's all bollocks. That's not transparent. That just shows the amount of ingenuity they've got to feed you what you want to see. Okay, so they would have to make choices about method and measures. That means that when the regulator turns up, the regulator is no longer in the business of writing all this stuff, and they write tons of it. Half their life is spent writing about what you ought to do. They should stop doing that. They should turn up and say, well, this is the purpose as defined by ministers. How have you interpreted that into measures and methods? And let's go and have a look, see what you're doing. And all of a sudden, it will be knowledge that is informing the debate. I just received a book by a man called Bartley Madden in Florida, and he's also an advocate of this idea that knowledge should be the key driving force in understanding and improving any system. Bang on. He says that knowledge and service are two sides of the same coin. Absolutely right.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I said we could talk about the NHS all day, but I am also aware that, and very happily aware, that there's quite a few international guests with us today. So do feel free to chip in with your own worries or concerns, even if they reflect your particular country. You're very, very, very welcome indeed. Somewhere in between is Chris Esmond, who is with us from Jersey. And Chris, what's your question or point, please?
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks, John. Yeah, so Jersey, we are Crown dependency of the UK. We have a very similar system to the NHS, but we are independent. But we see exactly the same problems that you're describing, and I think I agree with every word you've said so far, John. A couple of points I wanted to make. The point you make about demand overall not going up, but failure demand certainly increasing, I think is absolutely true. We've seen, I think, through the work that Brendan's done with Buurtzorg, through things like Hilary Cottam's work about focusing on sort of high risk individuals, families, neighborhoods, and doing intensive work has shown benefit. But I was wondering, do you have any examples of where the methodology has managed to spread wider than that across a health system? Because Jersey is a really interesting example. We actually have a health minister, going back to the previous question, we have a health minister who understands this. We have a health minister who wants to see sort of far more sensibly integrated services, he's got a lot of common sense as an individual. He doesn't see necessarily the need for over-regulation, but in fact the need to have well-equipped staff and to trust them to do the job. But we have a civil service that we've imported from Whitehall, and it's that culture that we have across the civil service that is blocking both change makers from the ground plus the minister from the top making that change. And there has to be a way of persuading them, because you think, oh, we've won the minister over, we're going to get somewhere now, and there's always a blocker in the way. And I guess the question is, how do we remove that blocker? And so much of it seems to come down to risk management and how those individuals want to count things throughout the organization and manage the risk, and nobody wants to hold the risk anymore, so the risk gets passed around and patients get passed around as a result. So how do you make that culture change at that level?
Well, that's the group that's got to study it. You know, the minister could insist that they study it. I saw this a lot in the work I was describing in the late 80s and 90s. The leader I worked with was brilliant, telling people they had no choice but to go study. But he used what I would call coercion as a tactic. You know, basically you're going to go study this, or I'm going to sack you. But by the time they've studied it and he's with them, supporting them, helping them, they'd move from fear to they'd kill for him. You know, so it's that group that's got to study. I mean, we've got plenty of examples. One that's on the web is one of our clients from Lincolnshire came with me to Malmo in Sweden, where there's a lot of this kind of work going on. I mean, the Swedes are quite good. They talk to each other, unlike us. They're doing a lot of this. So we went to Malmo to talk about it, and this is a set of GP practices where, when they actually understood what mattered to the cohort of older people and studied it, it's important that they do study it, because they all thought they were doing a great job for old people. Well, they were, according to the old regime, but actually, when you look at it from the old person's point of view, it was shit. So when they redesigned it, first to provide continuity, second to focus on the things that actually matter to this person, rather than things that are governed by your budget that tells you what you can do, what you can't do, and all that nonsense that goes on. What they demonstrated is that they were not only more effective in helping those people, but they did so at a much lower cost. And the consequential demand on the rest of the NHS services in that geography fell by 75%. It's a fuck me number, isn't it? It's huge. Now, the interesting thing, I'll tell you what, Chris, what's interesting is that I can put out an email that goes to a load of people running integrated care boards saying, just have a look at this, because you can do this. This is practical, it's evidence, it's not the only one. We've got lots of them, but this is one that happens to be on video. And with the age of technology, you can count how many people hit the video. Not one. And so I mean, I can only speculate, but I would imagine all the leaders in ICBs are all worried about, what's my job? How can we, we see this in local authorities as well at the moment. Angela Rayner, before she resigned, told local authorities they've got to become unitaries. And so any work on improving anything is stopped. And they're all worried about their job and sorting out their life. And that's what's happening, I think, in ICBs. But that's speculation. All I can tell you is that when shown something that is extremely powerful, straightforward, practical, can be done, not expensive, no IT, they didn't take an interest. Shame, eh?
Cool. If you have any particular suggestions on a single item to send people, I would very much appreciate it.
Do you have a senator there called, I think it's called Sarah Ferguson. Is she still there?
I think she passed away.
Oh, bless.
I think a couple of years back. Yes, we certainly did. She was a force to be reckoned with.
Well, and she was she got me over there twice to talk to audiences, but nobody wanted to play.
Well, John and Chris, I hope you can hook up afterwards and make that connection. We do have somebody from local government here, Michelle Anthony, who I'm going to bring in a couple of minutes. But first, I want to go over to Suki, who's from the Royal Free. Suki, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And continuing on the running theme of healthcare. So hopefully quite a straightforward question in that I am completely new to the world of failure demand and having heard about this concept. So for someone in the system, lots of the conversations have resonated, and I have a few decades more to spend, hopefully, in the health service. So I'm quite curious to understand how you might recommend going about learning a little bit more about this and eventually at some point putting this into practice. Would it be reading one of your particular books? Would it be something else? Yeah, just a bit of practical advice on how to learn a bit more.
Have you read Beyond Command and Control, Suki?
I have not.
Can I recommend it?
It's a good place to start because I do deal with care systems, and health and care systems are essentially the same to us. They also are, in principle, the same as all what we call break-fix systems. These are services that start with, this ain't right, this ain't working, or I need fixing, or whatever it is, and fix it. And in all of these break-fix systems, whether you're dealing with heating engineers in a house or people, patients attending the NHS, the purpose of the system is to accurately diagnose and then proportionately treat. And the NHS is crap at that. Because they're not focused on, I mean, isn't it an incredible thing that we keep getting reports of surgeons who've been doing terrible things to patients for years and they get discovered? Well, doesn't that tell you this is a system that isn't looking at how we diagnose and treat? We're looking at how many things they get through their factory. It's just the wrong thing to do. So read that. If you live long enough, my next book is going to talk a lot about the NHS because we do understand a lot about it. And get the newsletter because that summarizes the reasons for poor productivity. And then when you've absorbed all of that, give us a call and we'll talk to you about what we know and give you advice on where you might start.
Fabulous.
Thanks, John, and we'll follow up this event. We'll drop a line to you all, letting you know how you can contact John to get the newsletter. Also, with the half-price offer for Beyond Command and Control, which I can't recommend too highly. I think you'll find it is the introduction you need at this stage, Suki. So take a look at that. I'm going to bring in Hamish. I'm going to come back to you, Ali. I'm going to come back to you. as well. But I wanted to bring in Michelle, who's here with us from a local authority, and we haven't heard from somebody with that context yet. So, Michelle, welcome to you, and you have the floor.
Lovely. Thank you, Brendan. Hello there, Mr. Seddon. How are you?
All right, thanks, Michelle. How you
Good,
doing?
good. Yeah, not bad, thank you. I've got two questions. Hopefully, I've got enough time for them. So my
Okay.
first one is, how can local authorities shift from a cost-cutting mindset to a value-driven system design?
Right.
And my second one is, what has been the most successful application of the Vanguard method to date?
Blimey. Well, there's a lot of those. Let's do the first one. The first one. How do you move from a cost? Well, it's just these are the things that they have to study. You see, because one of the things that I teach people, if you manage costs, your costs go up. They can't see it, so it's no good telling them that it's going to drive their costs up because they'd be pissed off. So you've got to help them study to find out that what they're doing is driving their costs up, and you can only do that by studying the service end to end. It's like I was saying earlier, you don't know the cost of doing it the wrong way. I thought somebody else was speaking then. So that's the only answer, I'm afraid. You won't persuade people that managing costs is a bad idea. They have to learn that it's true. And then the way they learn that it's true, this is what I think is clever about the Vanguard method, he said with no humility whatsoever, is that they're looking, when the study goes on, they're studying it as a system. So they're starting to take a perspective that they'll use in the future when they design it, because that's looking at managing value rather than managing cost. But going back to successful things, well, in the late 80s and 90s, we turned around a series of companies that were then bought by other bigger companies, but they were dogs. The first one we worked in was losing £1 million a month, and it was in the mobile phone industry in the early days. And we got it to break even in 6 months, and within a year it was sold on to Vodafone. And that could have just fallen apart. It was losing a huge amount of money. You've got Aviva, where they had 500 people in India, 200 in the UK, and they wanted to bring all the work from India back. And we, they had a plan. We told them forget their plan, study it, redesign it. They ended up with 300 people in the UK providing amazing service. Who would have put in a plan you're going to go from 700 to 300 and get better? But after that, those kinds of opportunities are available in the health service. I can't. Yeah, there are many. Then I'll tell you what's important though, and that is that the pace of these changes depends entirely on the leaders. When the leaders get it, it goes like a train. I visited a company last week. I won't tell you who they are, but it's got some ex-Vanguard people in there, got a load of Vanguard fans in there, and they've made a big mistake. They've got those people are getting out and studying the work and then trying to convince management that things need to change. Dead loss. They'll just.
You mean the management has to do the study themselves?
Yeah. And what disappoints me is that there are people that I've taught in there, and they know you've got to put your foot down and say nothing happens until you come out and do this and so on. But of course, that's career limiting if you're employed. So maybe that's why they don't do it. But they know that the opportunity is going to go by, and they've also what they've got. Well, they've already studied shows that there's tremendous opportunity for actually improving sales. Tremendous. They are leaking away sales. But there we are. I can't tell you who it is, but that's a common mistake. It just won't work. So you've got to get the way to work with leaders is to just get them curious. Don't tell them that they need to change the way they think. Get them curious about things that are out there. So how do you get them curious? Well, watch a video, read a book, read a paper. Look at this thing that's happened in Lincolnshire that's talked about in Malmo. You know, these things will make some people curious. Not all of them, of course. I mean, Deming used to say, "Doesn't anybody give a hoot about profit?" You know, well, that's when he was, and you know, he wasn't known in the USA, his home country, and until what the miracle in Japan was discussed on television in 1980, and yet it happened 30 years before. And he was in the last 1 minute of that program. And then, so of course, everyone wanted to meet this guy, so he put on seminars, but he found that American management wasn't interested. Well, you've got to think about this like an interventionist. You know, well, American management, well, you know, they were doing fine. You know, they're succeeding in the market. They're making money. They're all competing. You know, they don't think they've got a problem. The Japanese managers knew they had a problem. But he also, one of my favorite Deming quotes is he used to say, "Let's make toast the American way. You burn, I'll scrape." Because his thesis was, you know, why is it that productivity improves when quality improves? And in manufacturing, the answer is always easy, no rework. Rework is invisible.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, for example, at Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, one of the most striking stats with Buurtzorg, who never really, I mean, they knew what their costs were and had a very simple way of understanding their costs, but they didn't go for cost control. What they went for was to get things right first time from the point of view of the person needing support. The consequence of that has been a reduction by more than half of the average numbers of the average time required per professional in Buurtzorg per client. So by focusing on value for the client, they've been able to bring that bring down the number of hours required. And of course, that's had a massive impact on costs.
Well, that's right. And one of the things you know, Brendan, is that I put out a podcast and I sent the transcript of it to Joost and he liked it.
He did like it.
I wanted to explain why these failed in the UK. And part of it is explaining why he was successful. You know, and as you know, and these people probably don't, Joost worked his way up the hierarchy in care services in the Netherlands. And he saw what we call new public management come in, all of this industrialization targets, all the bullshit that we've foisted on the public sector. And he argued against it. And because he was arguing against it, he was ostracized. So he buggered off to Ukraine. And then when the Dutch government put out a notice saying, look, social care isn't working, we want ideas, give us your ideas and we'll back them and we'll see what works. So he put forward his ideas, they backed him, and off it went.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and we've at a limit, I mean, not in the NHS, it has to be said, but in other contexts, we've begun to see similar results in terms of higher quality, fewer numbers of hours, therefore lower costs from some of the organizations we've been working with for a few years.
Yeah.
But they tend to be third sector organizations, charities or social enterprises that have sufficient independence from the wider NHS and local government system to be able to do things despite those systems rather than being constrained by them. But I retain hope that nevertheless it's possible to do even within the NHS, although my hope is declining rapidly that the NHS can make the kinds of changes that's needed. But certainly, Michelle, have you got any comeback on your question that you just asked before I bring in the last couple of questioners?
No, I don't. Thanks, Brendan.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. So, Hamish, you've been very patient. Let me bring you in.
Thank you, Brendan. Mine's more of a reflection. So, 20 years ago, I was a graduate management trainee at Surrey County Council, and John and colleagues were having conversations, John, you may remember, with a guy called Paul Cohen, who was chief exec, who wanted to bring in the Vanguard method across the whole organisation. And then he had cold feet, and then he didn't. And the consequence of that for me was I stumbled across John several years later at a think tank event in London. But in between times, I was put on very expensive business school training at Warwick to study things like finance for non-financial managers and other courses, and did work with really no knowledge. So my reflection is we don't do a very good job, certainly in this country and elsewhere, of teaching people how to lead and teaching people how to manage. We have to kind of make it up as we go along. The consequence of that is the failure demand that you see systematically across public and private sectors. So for me, it's about in order to pull, people have got to know, and people have got to know about this work, I would say. I think if I reflect on, we were talking about Deming, I think it was Marion Tribus that said that actually part of what happened also was that the Japanese went with Deming and did what Deming said, because if they didn't, they'd lose face. Now, there's an interesting impact on that for me, which isn't quite coercion, but it's something a little bit more than normative. And the other thing I think is I've been part of experiments outside of the Vanguard field that have had limited successes. I know other people have. We talk a lot about high intensity users, and directing this to Gary and Matthew in particular, changing futures. The one thing it hasn't done is apply the framework thinking systems performance. It's removes the systems element of the work. The consequence of that is, because you haven't engaged and haven't had senior leaderships thoroughly understanding this work, it doesn't grow and it doesn't sustain. In fact, it could be quite counterproductive. My other reflection, Gary, personally on the NHS is failure demand is all over the place. Right, it's not just about the vital few or the small numbers right at the top in all systems. It affects everybody every day, and that's everything from the inability of a system to be able to say to you, Gary, I need to understand you, not just one problem in 10 minutes, but we might need to take 20 minutes if that's what it means, or half an hour, 45 minutes, or repeat prescriptions, or wherever it might be. Matthew, in my experience, commissioners commission services in health and social care and 100% failure demand, but they don't know it because they haven't understood it. So for me, it's a plea about we've got to get this work, and I know John will smile at this point, far more recognised in the public profile and imagination. How do you percolate and penetrate people like senior civil servants, politicians, like Wes Streeting? Is a whole different ball game. We've also got to overcome what I call organisational Alzheimer's, because actually, in terms of the reform of the NHS at the moment, we're just going back to a playbook that failed 20 years ago under a certain Alan Milburn. We've got to learn to think differently about how to solve these problems.
Thanks, Hamish. Goodness me, we could go on for a long time, and I hope this conversation will go on actually well beyond this event, and perhaps you can connect with each other. I'll certainly be wanting to connect with many of you. But the last input we have time for before going back to John is from my colleague Ali.
Thank you, Brendan. That's great. Listening to everybody. I have read the book, and I've also seen various videos where your work, John, where you've been with the senior leaders, those at the top, and when you've shown them the detail and the failure demands, the effect that has. And I do believe they need to know that, and for real change to be transformative through an organisation. But hearing all of this and having first-hand knowledge of NHS through being carer for mum and dad and various other things. I've met Gary before, heard his two stories. I also have similar stories I won't share about when a GP speaks to me and my parents and knows us and holistic and deals with all our stuff, the real difference it makes. But what I fear from this conversation is that we're saying if we only go in, the only way in is at the top. And going with what Hamish has said, and John, with what you said about yours, is we have to still inspire those within the teams. We have to look at the ground where they have the answers, and we need to inspire those people. And there might be blockers at the top, but in the meantime, the more we can inspire those within the teams, the more they can learn. The little bits of difference of one person in the team or in a surgery, then that will spread. People will get to share their stories from Gary, and I think we have a duty, and us people in this room that can influence that, of starting small. So I think we need to see a ripple effect here. And yes, we're not going to change the NHS overnight. And some of us are critical of, I agree. And in your book, you talk about the huge potential for change if we look at failure demand in the NHS. But if we can't get to those people in the meantime, I believe we need to start small and smart. We start within small teams and do what we can there to influence, inspire and make some changes, because I think that has the potential, albeit it will slow, but we do need to start somewhere. And I personally, in my work, will go about doing that and learning where I can.
Well, I would very briefly just say this, Ali, that if a team is working in a system that's got a proper purpose and measures derived from purpose, they will have their tails up and they will be free to innovate. If a team is attempting to innovate in a conventional command and control structure, they're going to hit problems. As indeed Wurtzog did with the pilots in the health service. That's just the way it is.
I agree, but I hope they then will move on like yours and start their own organisations, and that's where I feel the potential is. The more people we can inspire, fine, they may move on, but maybe they'll move on to greater things, and that's the hope.
You're right, absolutely right. I mean, there was a time in about 2003, 2004 when we had, I think we had about 60 people working in Vanguard, and they were all people like that. They've done it, they've seen it, they're enthusiastic about it, and I would just say, yeah, come on, I don't mind, yeah, come on.
Hamish, I'm not going to be able to bring you.
But let me just say this. I think the lever, which is what I'm writing about in this book, is to change Basically, I'm saying that if the politicians follow my prescription, and then the leaders of service organization follow the principles in this book, then we're going to have a massive amount of growth as well as a lot more happiness.
This is a great way to end, actually. Hamish, I'm sorry I can't bring you back in, but this is a great way to end, because actually what Ali and John have just been discussing is exactly what I'm going to be exploring in the short book that I'm currently writing about the 10 years of our experience working in partnership with Buurtzorg for most of that time, which really was an experience of a really willing, committed, and on a small scale, very successful introduction of self-organized teams working in a very relational way, but being stymied by their organizations and by the systems around them, which eventually actually within the NHS has strangled most of the initiatives. That's undeniable. This is, for me, this has been a very interesting and insightful exploration of some of these issues, but we've hardly scraped the surface. But we do think it's important to end on time as well as starting on time. And we're a minute late. So with apologies for that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. We'll follow up, as I said, with some links and so on. But I particularly want to thank John. John, it's been fantastic. Thanks. And urge you, there's a half price offer on this book. If you ain't got it, get it now, because it's a lot of the questions that we've been exploring today. You'll find the answers in this book. I'm very much looking forward to your next one as well. So with that, I'm going to close for today. Thanks again, everybody.